All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for the Wyeths and an American artistic dynasty. The Wyeth family of artists is known for their somber realism and subtle storytelling. We're going to explore the style of painting and illustration established by N.C. Wyeth in the early 1900s and passed on and reinterpreted by his children, primarily Andrew Wyeth and his grandson, Jamie Wyeth. We're going to learn more about their favorite subjects, their influences, and their enduring impact in the art world. And this is all led this morning by art historian Jane Oneail, who's the founder of Culturally Curious, a company that curates and delivers art appreciation programs for audiences worldwide. With a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University, Jane has worked at some of New Hampshire's most esteemed cultural institutions, including as an executive director of the League of Women, League of Women Voters. No, that's something else. With the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, as well as senior educator at the Currier Museum of Art. And Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. And I again want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Corning Life Sciences Foundation for sponsoring today's program and sponsoring most of our programs online this month. So all nearly 175 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jane for joining us today. And Jane, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about the Wyeths. You're probably here because you love them already, or maybe you've never heard of them before and you just want to find out what all the hubbub is about. Either way, you're not going to be disappointed because this family of artists was able to produce just an absolutely astounding body of work. So what we're going to do today is focus on 3 generations of the Wyeth family and their tremendous impact on American art and culture. Now, we're going to primarily focus on 3 artists, although there were a lot of artists in the family, and consider kind of the connecting thread between them, other than genetics, obviously. Now, it's kind of amazing that there is a connecting thread in terms of their visual language, because these 3 artists kind of all found their own paths, despite the fact that they had similar training and they all spent their lives essentially in the same areas. I saw we had some people on today from Pennsylvania and from Maine, and so some of these places might be really familiar to you or might prompt a road trip real soon. So we will be getting back to this fantastic image on the screen, which I'm sure everybody has seen at some point in their lives, Christina's World. But for now, let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our time together. I'm going to do a quick introduction to the family, and then we'll turn our attention to the patriarch of that family, N.C. Wyeth, and then we'll get acquainted with his 5 children pretty quickly because they were all very creative in their own rights. But it's his youngest son, Andrew, who goes on to sort of be the shining star in the world of painting. So we'll focus on Andrew Wyeth's artistic output. And then finally, with Andrew Wyeth's youngest son, Jamie, who is still alive and working today. And we have a very brief conclusion. There's a lot to unpack here. As I was reviewing this program, I thought to myself, this should really be 3 separate programs. Maybe sometime in the future, we'll break it out and flesh it out a little bit more. Okay, so a very quick introduction to the Wyeth family. I've got our little family tree here as well as a photograph. So it really all begins with the artist Newell Converse Wyeth. That's N.C. Wyeth. And he and his wife, Carolyn, have, as I mentioned, 5 children. Henriette is the oldest. We see Andrew at the end here is the youngest, and then we'll be getting to meet Andrew's son, Jamie, a little bit later on. But we can see the family when they were still relatively young here. This is young Andrew Wyeth, kind of perched in the middle. And I just wanted to share with you a quick story from N.C. Wyeth when he was a young man training, preparing to become an illustrator himself. He was attending a school with a preeminent artist named Howard Pyle. He was an illustrator. It was a really competitive program to get into. So you can imagine N.C. Wyeth really looked up to this instructor, Howard Pyle. And one day during a lunch break, N.C. Wyeth watched his instructor gather up his large family. He had 5 or 6 kids of his own, and he and his wife and his young family sat underneath a tree and had a picnic lunch together. And just watching this family and their dynamics just inspired N.C. Wyeth. It sort of like set a fire in his belly for what he wanted for his own life. So much so that as a young man, he actually wrote a letter to his mother describing that vision of his instructor and his instructor's loving family, and sort of proclaiming for himself at a young age that that was exactly what he wanted to. And remarkably, he was able to do it. He was able to have these 5 children, and he very much focused on raising them and cultivating this creative spirit in all of them. So we'll get a sense of that along the way. But for now, we're going to zoom in a little bit closer on Newell Converse Wyeth, our patriarch for the day. Here he is in another photograph. Now, N.C. Wyeth was born in 1882, so he really sort of became a man right around the turn of the century. He grew up in Needham, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. His family was sort of involved in arts and culture. They were sort of oriented that way. And so he was able to attend an art school, what is now the Mass College of Art and Design. And it was there that his instructors recommended that he go into commercial illustration, that he study illustration specifically. I don't think this was even on his radar before then. Maybe his family was a little bit more highbrow. Maybe they sort of imagined that he would be a fine art artist. So in 1902, N.C. Wyeth travels to the Brandywine River Valley in southeastern Pennsylvania, and he starts up this special training to be an illustrator with Howard Pyle, that instructor that had inspired him, as I mentioned. And it was a really competitive program for him to get into. I think 300 people applied. He was one of 3 students that was accepted. And I think he felt pretty good about that, pretty confident, because as a young man, just about 24, 25 years old, he actually submits a painting for consideration for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. We can see a photograph of young N.C. Wyeth from around that time. And then the painting that was actually selected by the Saturday Evening Post in 1903 to be on the cover. Now, you can imagine there were so many aspiring young artists in the country who would have died for this opportunity. And N.C. Wyeth sort of gets it like the first time he tries. So I think he was feeling pretty confident about his prospects as an artist. And I wanted to kind of spend a little extra time with this image that the Saturday Evening Post picked from him, because there's some really important elements here. We see like a Bronco buster on the cover here, and he's kind of like breaking this horse. The horse is like up in midair, all 4 of the feet off the ground. The rider's kind of struggling to stay on. He's got this switch up in his hand to continue to control the animal. But if you think about it, I mean, this is a really kind of wild scene, frozen in time. It would be a hard thing for an artist to just visualize, because certainly couldn't have a model on a horse frozen in this pose. So you can imagine in 1903, this would have really knocked the socks off of the public who walking by a newsstand. They would have looked twice, right? And just the subject of a cowboy would have been almost like a romantic subject to a lot of people around this time, as the country's kind of rapidly industrializing. A subject of a cowboy is like almost like, not like forgotten lore per se, but it was a little thing of a romantic past. Now, there's one other detail from the Bronco Buster picture here that didn't make it onto the cover. And so I just want to show you what he actually submitted versus what was actually printed. I've got the little patch of grass, we get the rider, but you'll also notice that there is a hat, the rider's hat, the cowboy's hat has flown off his head and is flying through the air. You can see why the Saturday Evening Post didn't want to really disrupt the text in the masthead here. But I'm always intrigued by that little hat, because it is so close to the edge of the canvas. And it's such a strange or unusual choice for an artist to use space in this way. Usually they like to leave a nice margin around the canvas. And what we'll be seeing with so many of these Wyeth artists is that they are always kind of flirting with the edge of things, whether it's the canvas or some sort of border. And we really see it right off the bat with our Bronco Buster here. So N.C. Wyeth begins to specialize in cowboys. Believe it or not, the Saturday Evening Post actually sends him to the American Southwest. He gets to like camp out and study cowboys firsthand. I have just one more cowboy for you from his covers from the Saturday Evening Post. And we can see that this becomes a little bit of a specialty. Also, painting rugged outdoors kinds of subjects. This was his area of expertise in the first decade of the 20th century. There is something really nostalgic about this particular cowboy from 1907. He's set in profile against this big blazing orange setting sun. It's like the sun is setting on the very existence of the notion of American cowboys. He's got this giant hat, a giant mustache, the big scarf here, and he is, the ultimate tough guy. There is a ruggedness to this that I think, everybody who's ever enjoyed a Western movie could probably kind of understand. So what's kind of fun, I just wanted to quickly share with you, just a couple decades later on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, artists like Norman Rockwell are almost kind of making fun of this notion of the rugged cowboy because the sun had set on them by this point in the 20th century. But notice how Norman Rockwell almost seems to be quoting N.C. Wyeth's cowboy directly, only the hat's bigger, the mustache is bigger, the scarf is bigger. Oops, and sorry, now he is no longer even outside. He's just listening to the old tunes that remind him of the way things used to be. So we have this notion of N.C. Wyeth breaking out in his career, doing these magazine covers, and that was always kind of a part of his work. But the way he became familiar to most Americans, I think, was through illustrating books. And he actually illustrated over the course of his career 112 different books, including 25 of the Scribner's classics for children. So here's the cover that he painted for Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. And over here on the right, you can see that his paintings for the book are full-size oil paintings that are then reproduced and included in the text. So his idea of what a cowboy, or sorry, not a cowboy, of what a pirate looks like for Treasure Island are very influential in American culture, probably informs the way, Johnny Depp plays his character in Pirates of the Caribbean. But these were really striking images. And since they were in these children's classics, these were the kinds of images that helped to expand the story itself for young readers. These were the kinds of images that little kids just pored over. They really spent their time studying these images. So I wanted to just dig a little bit deeper into Treasure Island here, because essentially what N.C. Wyeth was doing was taking one line of text and expanding it into a picture. And we always say a picture's worth 1,000 words. And so you could say so much about these expanded images that Wyeth created. So over here on the left is a scene from early on in the book where the protagonist of Treasure Island, Jim Hawkins, says he leaves home. The text is, "I said goodbye to my mother and the cove." And so here he is off to kind of make his fortune, make his future. And we can see he's got his little like hobo stick here. He's stepping away from his home, but we can also see the sadness and the devastation of his mother. We get these soft kind of pillowy clouds in the sky, which are echoed by the rocks that he is walking along out towards us. His mother set out there in the sunlight, and now he is in shadow. His future's a little bit uncertain, right? Over here on the right, this is another moment in the text, and the expanded text here is just one more step Mr. Hand. So now Jim Hawkins is fighting with a pirate. He's in a boat. He's sort of like up on the crow's nest. And it's a dramatic scene. This almost looks like a moment in time from a Hollywood movie today. And the drama is highlighted by all of these diagonals in the composition, from the rigging of the boat to the diagonal of the arms of this pirate. Notice how the knife is sort of like coming out almost into our space. We are very aware of it. And then we can see our protagonist up here with the pistols in his hand pointing down at the pirate. So it's like a heart-stopping scene, but it's one that young people, well, any reader could have spent some time with and sort of absorbed and delighted in, things like the blue of the water in the background. So these were images that could transport people, and well, they sort of transported NC Wyeth too, because after selling the 17 paintings that he made for the Treasure Island text, he was able to buy 18 acres of land and build a home and studio. So he was doing pretty well for himself as a young man. This was in 1911. He would go on to raise his 5 children here at his home and studio in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. If you become, and this all happened before he even turned 30 years old. So don't ever tell anybody that they shouldn't become an artist, right? So if you happen to live near Pennsylvania or Chadds Ford, or if you want to go on a road trip, I highly recommend going to visit these sites, because they are open to the public and available at tours. And this gives us a sense in terms of where he was raising this big creative family. So I wanted to show you just a few more illustrations that he was creating for these children's classics, because they have such a remarkable cinematic quality to them. I just love them. So over here on the left, we have a scene from The Boys King Arthur, a joust scene. And here's just a little bit of information about me and my family that kind of helps me to understand this joust scene. Because before I met my husband, believe it or not, he was a professional jouster. He jousted around the world, and he was on a reality show about jousting. And one of the reasons the reality show was kind of a miss is because jousting happens so fast. 2 horses charging at each other. And yes, there's like splintering lances and all of this, but for NCY to be able to freeze this moment and give us that moment of impact, and then the splintering lance flying off into the distance, plus the romantic knights in their armor here, it's just fantastic. Then we have this wonderful scene over here from The Last of the Mohicans, this kind of like wrestling scene on the edge of a waterfall. You don't know who's going to fall over the edge. And of course, there's another knife blade here that takes us into the scene. It's all just stunning. The colors are really kind of crisp too. It's great storytelling. It isn't all high action and drama, although those are very compelling. Here's just one more scene from The Boys King Arthur, where we have King Arthur with Merlin here, and this is where he's given Excalibur from this disembodied hand that rises up through the water. Again, it looks cinematic. They're floating along this very placid body of water, and the swans are flying by. I mean, NC Wyeth did a great job at creating really compelling, really moving images that I think probably helped to shape the vision of so many directors today. But at the heart and soul of everything he was doing was his family. And what we're looking at right now is a 1932 mural that he did for the Wilmington Savings Fund Society, which was like a bank in Wilmington, Delaware. And it's called the apotheosis of the family, the culmination of the family, the highest point of development for the family. And so we can see right at the center, there's this young family, and guess what? They have 5 kids, just like NC Wyeth, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and a babe in arms. And essentially what he's saying is that every other good thing in the world is a result of this family. And this is a reminder to us how important NC Wyeth's own family was to him. You can also see evidence of this in this next picture here, which is not only about family, but it's about cultivating that imagination too. This is a painting that NC Wyeth did sort of in honor of one of his own painting students who had passed away around the age of 30. And so he created this image as like a gift to essentially in honor of that student that passed away. So it's called The Giant. And what we see here are six little kids on the shoreline, just playing in the sand at the beach. It's like the most childlike, innocent thing to do. But in this painting, they've all paused in their play and they are sharing the vision of this enormous giant sort of just clomping by with a huge club over his shoulder. He's like in and of the clouds. And notice just how romantic and puffy those clouds are. Oh, NC Wyeth could paint some very romantic clouds with the pinks and the lavenders down here. And I just love the idea of these kids playing a game and it kind of coming to life right before their eyes. This is NC Wyeth telling us how he prioritizes creativity in childhood. And apparently, this little boy over here whose back is to us all the way on the left, this was this was like he imagined this was like the young man who had passed away, who'd been his painting student. But the rest of the children on this shoreline were inspired by his own kids. So once again, his family is kind of at the heart of what he does. Their creativity is so important to him. Now, NC Wyeth is incredibly successful as a commercial artist, meaning he is creating paintings for commercial purposes, for magazine covers, for books, what have you. But there was always something nagging inside him where he wanted to do more beyond that, be a fine art artist, which he thought was sort of one step above. Some people at the time referred it to like an easel artist. And so here we see him taking a stab at that. This is a painting that he did called Buttonwood Farms from 1920. And here we can see this kind of connection to the farmland of southeastern Pennsylvania, where he ended up kind of setting up his home in Chadds Ford. We see these beautiful romantic kind of pastel colors, sort of similar to the giant scene that we just saw before, a little bit of maybe of American Impressionism thrown in there. And these were pretty warmly received, these kinds of paintings, but they didn't uh, introduce a new path in his life, unfortunately. Now, even though he's living in Pennsylvania, he has enough money to take his family on vacations and then ultimately buy a vacation house in Midcoast, Maine. And this is a painting of the house that he buys there. He actually names his house. This is a painting that he did, I should say, too. He names this house after a painting by the famed 19th century American artist who spent so much of his time in Maine, too. This is a painting by Winslow Homer called Eight Bells. And so NC Wyeth named his Maine vacation house in honor of Winslow Homer in this painting. He called it Eight Bells, too. So he's always kind of aspiring for more, never quite gets there, unfortunately. Now, around the time of World War II, his services are put into good use for some of the posters to buy war bonds. And this is the artist that could paint these incredible action scenes. So, of course, it's all wrapped in here together. We've got Uncle Sam, we've got the planes flying in formation, the soldiers advancing down below with their bayonets, and those big romantic clouds here too. It's all wonderfully staged here. Now we're going to shift back to NC Wyeth himself. We can see him here in a self-portrait from about 1940. We get a sense in terms of who he is, what he looks like. Again, this connection to the land where they were living was really important. But NC Wyeth passes away in 1945, about 5 years after this painting. And the circumstances of his death are supremely tragic. He was known to do regular errands. He would pick up his little grandson, who I think was about 5 years old or so, who was named after him. They'd get in the car and they'd go off and they'd do their errands. And one day, NC Wyeth's car stopped on some train tracks, and a train approached. It blew its whistle several times, but NC Wyeth's car never moved. The train hit the car. I believe it pushed it along the tracks for several hundred feet. And unfortunately, NC Wyeth and his grandson both passed away. Now, There's a lot of questions as to why the car didn't move. Did he intentionally place it on the tracks? Was this an attempt to take his own life? Was he blinded by the sun? Did the car stall? Well, we'll never really know. But I think because of those unknown circumstances, a little bit of gossip has sort of ballooned up over the years that perhaps N.C. Wyeth was having an affair with his son's wife, his lovely daughter-in-law named Caroline, who we can just sort of glimpse in the photographs over here, along with her son. And that maybe even that grandson that was named after him was actually not a grandson, but a son. Maybe he was reckoning with all of this, and ultimately decided to take his life. Of course, we will never know, but that little piece of gossip is out there. So as we wrap up on NCY, just that reminder that he was so invested as a father. Here is a photograph of him in this very large studio that he had. You can see it needed to be big because he had to do these enormous paintings. That's him with just one section of the apotheosis of the family. And here's just one more photograph before we switch gears and get an introduction to the second generation here. So very quickly, as a reminder, he had these 5 children: Henriette, Carolyn, Nathaniel, and Anne. And then we'll turn our attention to Andrew. This is Henriette, and she was really his only child that went away. She became a painter herself, despite some like crippling of her hand from polio. And she also married another painter named Peter Hurd, and they lived in the Southwest. But her training as an artist, particularly from coming from the Wyeth family, meant that she got the best training. She also got great contacts. Here is Henriette's portrait of Patricia Nixon from 1978. This is in the collection of the White House in Washington, D.C. You can see that Henriette, who is perhaps an artist you've never heard of, was like a 20th century John Singer Sargent. Essentially, she could create a really flattering portrait. His next daughter, Carolyn, did not grow up and move away. Here we see Carolyn standing in front of an easel. She was also a painter. Carolyn lived in that house with N.C. Wyeth right up until her death in 1994. And she was intimately involved in training other artists, helping N.C. Wyeth to train other artists too. So she was kind of an artist and an educator, but very much celebrated during her own life. This is a painting that she did. I believe this is from the 1970s as well, from 1974, and it's called Up from the Woods. And you can just glimpse the edge of that family homestead through the trees over here. So they're all kind of wedded to realism to a certain degree, but willing to make some kind of fanciful adjustments to it along the way. Now, his third child, Nathaniel, is kind of a different story here. Nathaniel was not like his other children. Apparently, when he was a young toddler, they used to put him out in his baby carriage in like a sun porch to let him nap. And when he'd wake up from those naps, his hands would be covered in grease. They couldn't understand why. And then they realized that when they put him out in the sun porch and left him there, he was wheeling himself around. N.C. Wyeth realized that this young son was creative in a different way. He was like an engineer. And he actually legally changed his son's name from Newell Converse to Nathaniel, because he thought, I'm not going to burden my son with an artist's name. So he named him after another member of the family who was more scientifically oriented. Nathaniel Wyeth went on to have a great career in terms of like engineering, scientific design. And for better or worse, he actually designed the plastic soda bottle. So we can see him here in a little illustration where his father's got the paintbrush head and he's got the soda bottle head here in the background. Now, the last of this generation that I wanted to introduce you to in this section is Anne Wyeth. And she sort of went off on a path of her own as well, but still a very creative one. She did some painting, but she was also really interested in music. She played the piano and she was a musical composer. And just to give you a sense in terms of how celebrated this Wyeth family of artists was, Anne would often compose the music that would be played at the White House when her family was being received there. So, I mean, talk about like American royalty, right? So they were just rubbing elbows with all the most important people. So now we turn our attention to the youngest in the family, and that's Andrew Wyeth. And so here we can see him in two photographs at a fairly young age. He was born in 1917, and he was kind of a sickly child. He really had to spend a lot of time at home. And so he learned right at the master's knee. His father kind of poured everything that he had into his youngest son in terms of his training. And by the time he was a teenager, Andrew Wyeth was helping his father fulfill commissions, maybe even sometimes fulfilling them for his father. But he also wanted to strike out on his own. So one of the things that he did was he began to work in media that were different from his father. He developed an incredible talent as a watercolor artist. Now his father was working in oils and probably couldn't do this sort of thing, but at the age of 20, Andrew Wyeth was able to have an exhibition of his watercolors at the Macbeth Gallery in New York City, and it sold out. This was something that N.C. Wyeth, his father, was never able to do. Now, I always in awe of people that can paint in watercolor. It just takes so much control. You really have to understand just how much pigment and how much water is on your brush. And so I always just so admire the way the paint is applied here and the way, the white paper is reserved as well. But I want to give you a sense in terms of the difference, the dynamic between Andrew Wyeth and his father. So here is an Andrew Wyeth watercolor of a lobsterman. Here is an N.C. Wyeth oil painting of the same subject. And you can see when N.C. Wyeth paints a subject of the lobsterman, it's almost like an advertisement for lobsterman, right? It's clear, it's almost he almost places the boat almost symmetrically in the composition. The figure looks heroic. We are to admire him, right? But the way Andrew conceives of a composition is much more nuanced, much more complicated. Oftentimes we can see that there's like these interesting intersecting lines, almost like V's here, these waves, and then the boat is going off. Well, the boat is kind of foreshortened, and the lobsterman himself is leaning over towards the back. We don't really see him or know what he's doing. So it makes for a really interesting, compelling composition. And I think it sort of speaks to the difference between them. Now, Andrew Wyeth, we can see here in a self-portrait from I think this is 43. He's in his late 20s. We've got kind of this dark and moody palette. He's a young artist. He's got his portfolio in his hands, and we can also see he's walking through the fields of Chaddsford, Pennsylvania. I wanted to show you this particular image because of these tall grasses that become signature elements of his work, but also this bird here in flight, just hovering over the horizon line. And the way it's flirting with that edge sort of reminded me of the hat with the Bronco Buster there. The Wyeths really aren't afraid to use atypical spaces here. Now, shortly after this self-portrait was painted, Andrew Wyeth's father, N.C. Wyeth, tragically dies. And one of the ways he deals with that is through painting. This is one of the first works that he created following his father's death. This is called Winter from 1946. And here we can see a figure who is stumbling down this hill, almost like in free fall, right? And notice again the way the hill line there flirts with the edge of the canvas. Notice too the car the tire marks in the scene. Now they might have been there in real life. They probably were there in real life, but Andrew Wyeth has this tendency to include them in his paintings, and people like to sort of extrapolate that he's thinking of his father when he does that. Now at this time, Andrew Wyeth is painting in tempera. It tends to have this sort of muted tone to it. Again, it's a different medium than his father worked in, and it's a very challenging medium. Here's another example of his egg tempera paintings. This was called Wind from the Sea. Notice how he takes these lace curtains here and they begin to kind of dissolve like unravel, come apart as they float away from the window. Remember the cracks in old-fashioned shades like this, the light kind of coming through. Here he is inside this space, you could almost say trapped inside. And once again, we're seeing those tire tracks off in the distance. So perhaps he's still kind of dealing with this death from his father. Now, Andrew Wyeth is, of course, best known for his paintings of Christina Olsen. And here we can see his first kind of foray into painting Christina Olsen and her home. This was a family that he became connected to up in Cushing, Maine. So it was where his father, close to where his father's vacation house was. Andrew Wyeth was a young man in his late 20s, early 30s when he met the Olsens and began to use an upstairs room in their 1700s farmhouse as a studio. And at first, he was really fascinated by the architecture, this kind of weather-beaten house that they lived in. And then eventually, he became intrigued by Anna Christina Olsen, who was about 20 years older than him, and began to include her in his compositions as well. And eventually, that leads us to his famous work, Christina's World, painted when he was 31 years old. It's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, purchased shortly after it was made, which was a real coup for a young artist of the day. It's one of the most popular paintings in the collection. And of course, it's kind of this psychological landscape. We don't see her face, but we get this sense of distress of this young woman who's lying in this field, who seems to be looking up at this house. And she is in this state of paralysis, but there's a sense of urgency here as well. The house looks so mysterious, but it's this bright day at the same time. There's so much going on here to unpack, but because we see this figure from behind, we project ourselves into her and we can feel what she's feeling. Again, there are those car tracks too. Now, this was a really unusual way to paint at the time. This is 1948, and this is right around the time artists like Jackson Pollock are starting to do non-objective paintings, drip and splatter paintings. And here is Andrew Wyeth creating something that looks like it could have been painted 100 years earlier. And it's of a rural scene. There's nothing really avant-garde about it. But I will say there's something about this wild field of tall grass here, which took him about 2 months to paint, if I'm remembering correctly, that does have a little bit of that sense of abstraction there. Now, that 1700s farmhouse is now a National Historic Site. You can go and visit it. It's owned and operated by the Farnsworth Museum. And you yourself can lie down in the grass and have this Anna Christina Olsen moment there. You'll notice that the landscape is really different. It's not that giant hill that Andrew Wyeth painted, although there is a slope there. And at the bottom of that slope is actually the Olsen family cemetery. Looking up at that farmhouse, Andrew Wyeth actually requested to be buried alongside Anna Christina Olsen. So his grave is there as well. Now, just a few more works from Andrew Wyeth really quickly. This is a painting that he did in 1963 in honor of his wife, Betsy. Somebody just asked me yesterday if he had had an affair with Anna Christina Olsen. No, he was married to a woman named Betsy. They stayed together throughout his entire life. And in very subtle, understated paintings like this one, he honors her by painting the curtains that she had sewn, including little details like, the organization of shells that she had collected and the little heart in the rough-hewn chest here in the foreground. They were a very smart family in terms of the way they marketed his art, and they were actually able to sell this painting for $65,000 back in 1963 to the Farnsworth Museum up in Maine, which was at the time the highest price any museum had ever paid to a living artist for a work of art. So he was doing pretty well for himself. And a scene like this might remind you of another one of Andrew Wyeth's most famous paintings. This is called The Master Bedroom from 1965. There's not much more to add about this one, but of course we all love that dog. A friend of mine has a daughter who is a housekeeper, and she says every house that she cleans has a print of this work in the bedroom. There is something, even though there's this austerity to the scene, a quintessentially Wyeth austerity to it, there is something so loving about the way that this dog is curled up on the bed. Now, Andrew Wyeth encountered a great deal of controversy back in 1985, 84, 85, when, sorry, this was 1986, when a bombshell was dropped, and his work was featured simultaneously on the cover of Time and Newsweek magazine, claiming that he had been having an affair for 15 years and had been painting this woman named Helga simultaneously. So Helga's featured on the cover, and this big cache of secret work, paintings and drawings of Helga, became public. And you can see there were plenty of nudes, very sensual nudes, and it became this major scandal. But it also launched a major exhibition of these works at the National Gallery of Art, which was another coup because he was the first living artist to ever have that honor. So it might have just been a very calculated move on his part, but these are really stunning works of Helga. This one's called The Daydream. This one over here is called The Lovers. I just wanted to show you another example of a work of Helga here. Look at the way he's painted this 1977 painting called Braids. This egg tempera lets him paint like these individual hairs in just a stunning way. He's captured the flesh of her face, the wool of that sweater in such just a mind-boggling realism here. It's just astonishing to me. So Helga ends up becoming a family friend. He never divorces his wife. You can extrapolate from that what you wish, but in the end, Helga actually gets to keep that vacation house that his father purchased in Maine. So she is something of a Wyeth institution as well. Andrew Wyeth's very last painting, called Goodbye, was painted the year before his death in 2008. And it's, again, this kind of classic, kind of subdued Wyeth colors. We've got a little bit of the Maine coastline here too, with the sailboat kind of sailing off, not into the sunset, almost looks like it's going to run ashore, but we've got the trail of it here. And again, it almost reminds me of those tire tracks to a certain degree. But it is a gorgeous curtain call. Andrew Wyeth was a highly celebrated artist during his time. This is him receiving the National Medal of Arts in 2007. So we will spend our remaining time with Andrew Wyeth's second son. He had two boys. His first son, Nicholas, became an art dealer. His second son, Jamie, followed in the family footsteps. Jamie Wyeth was born in 1946. We can see him here as a young man sitting alongside his father. Probably recognize that painting behind them there of his mother's space, really. And Jamie Wyeth was well, Andrew Wyeth received training from his father. Jamie Wyeth received the benefit of training from his aunt, Carolyn, too. But he received the benefit of all of these family connections, of having the Wyeth name. So if he wanted to study anatomy, Andrew Wyeth would just call up the New York City morgue and make arrangements for his son to go and study anatomy. I just finished an art talk on Leonardo da Vinci the other night. And let me tell you, when he wanted to study anatomy, it was not that easy, right? So despite all of these advantages, these privileges of coming from this artistic family, Jamie Wyeth really had something from an early age. He painted this work, I believe, when he was just 17 years old. This is 1963, and it's called A Portrait of Shorty. He had wanted to paint this figure who's almost like a hermit in the town that they lived in. And when Shorty found out that he was going to be the subject of a painting, he went and shaved his hair and his beard and all of that. So he looked really different from what Jamie Wyeth was originally imagining. So you can see kind of the 5 o'clock shadow here. You can see his pale skin, every single bulge and pocket of flesh, the wrinkles here, and then these green hazel eyes, which perfectly match the very fancy silk damask chair that he's sitting in. Notice too the way the edges of that chair just flirt with the edges of the canvas. This is that continuing thread from generation to generation. Now, Jamie Wyeth is a mind-boggling talent at a young age, and those family connections lead him to painting this portrait of Lincoln Edward Kirstein in 1965. This is at the National portrait gallery. Now, Kirstein was like this major mover and shaker in the art world. He was like the founder of the New York City Ballet, if I'm remembering correctly. He'd also been a monuments man during World War II. He knew everybody and like had his fingers in everything. What a fascinating way to paint him, right? I'm going to stand with your back to me and I'm going to paint you in like a reverse three-quarter profile. Of course, he does have this very distinctive nose here, but it's a really striking portrait. And you can see that he is like setting the stage for this great career in portraiture. And when Jamie Wyeth is just about 20 years old, he is like handpicked by Jackie Kennedy and Robert Kennedy to paint the official portrait of JFK posthumously. So Jamie Wyeth spends all this time with the Kennedys, with Teddy Kennedy, with Robert Kennedy, going to rallies with them, studying the way that they move so that he could really kind of embody that in JFK's portrait. The end result is just wonderful. It's breathtaking. It feels like he was sitting right there with the president, even though this was painted posthumously. He doesn't hide the strabismus in the president's eye here. He makes him seem sort of relaxed and thoughtful and engaged in speaking at the same time. I guess he sort of makes it feel like we're all in the same room with the president. There's this wonderful immediacy to it. And Jamie Wyeth did something so smart. He said he would paint this portrait, but that it would not be the official portrait of JFK. So he was able to keep it. And it was like another feather in his cap. Here is Jamie Wyeth from probably about 10 years ago now, standing in front of this work that was as mounted as part of a retrospective at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Interestingly, President Joe Biden requested this work of Kennedy to be on loan at the White House during his tenure as president. So I imagine it's still there. And I believe it was situated just outside of the Oval Office. I'm always fascinated by what presidents choose for their artwork. So Jamie Wyeth, then his career sort of takes an interesting turn. He has the privilege of kind of becoming a quirky personality. This is his self-portrait called Pumpkinhead from 1972. He he apparently he would occasionally do things like wear a pumpkin on his head for family gatherings. He was tasked with creating a self-portrait to gain admission to uh, the National Academy of Design, and they ultimately rejected the Pumpkinhead portrait. He ended up submitting something much more traditional like this one, and gained acceptance. But we can see that he's kind of playful. He's interested in something that's a little bit whimsical and maybe even a little bit mysterious as well. Now he gets married to a woman named Phyllis. This is them at a young age, and interestingly, Phyllis is sort of like this continuing thread with Anna Christina Olsen, because Phyllis had been in a car accident earlier on in life and had limited use of her legs, so she often walked with crutches. So in this painting over here, we can see Jamie Wyeth has created a portrait of his wife kind of driving these horses, and they become like her legs in this particular uh, uh, painting here. So his life is set on this wonderful course. He could be the painter of the rich and famous at this point, but he begins to make really interesting choices. He gravitates towards animals instead of painting, heads of state. He's painting giant pigs, like we see over here. This is from 1971. Here is a painting of a ram that he created in 1975. This is up at the Farnsworth Museum, and it really is kind of a knockout of a painting when you see it in person. This was a ram that lived on an island close to the island that Jamie Wyeth was living on. He would oftentimes go to that island and help the farmer there kind of shear his sheep. And then the farmer died, the sheep were taken away, and this ram became like the lead, like the king of this island, and he wouldn't let anybody else onto it. Eventually, Jamie Wyeth like gains the ram's trust, and he's able to go and create this very respectful, very dignified vision of this ram on the island. But Jamie Wyeth didn't completely retreat from like society. In fact, he was still very much engaged in it. And in 1976, he and none other than Andy Warhol decided that they wanted to paint portraits of each other to exchange them. And if Andy Warhol is interested in painting your portrait, that means you're an important person, or it certainly means that at the very least you're famous and beautiful. So these are Jamie Wyeth's attempts at painting Andy Warhol. We can see that this is like a watercolor sketch where he was thinking about doing it in profile. The end result is, I would say, a shockingly realistic portrait of Andy Warhol. We can see he's wearing the wig. We can see the imperfections of his skin. He almost looks stunned in this particular image. And I think in this sort of gift exchange of these portraits, I think Jamie Wyeth sort of wins out because, of course, Andy Warhol makes him look like this romantic superstar hero. He might as well be like Mick Jagger here too, right? But this gives you a sense in terms of this role that he's played in American life. So, with very short time left, I think what I will do is we'll just switch to our conclusion for now and just draw this thread through these generations. We're going to use pumpkins to do that as we're heading into fall here. And we can see that N.C. Wyeth really starts this family with these oil paintings, with these illustrations, with the storytelling, these very kind of wholesome American images, with this idea of a wholesome American life for his family. His son, Andrew, takes everything that he learned from his father, but he puts his own bend on it. He works in watercolor, he works in tempera paintings. He's really interested in these kind of swelling mountains and these mysterious scenes, these muted tones. I love this pile of white pumpkins with just a little peek of the orange pumpkin coming out in the distance here. And then finally we get to Jamie, who is also working in oil paints. And he's very interested in realism, but there's a playfulness and an irreverence to so many of his paintings. This one is called Mischief Night over here. These artists have had such an incredible impact on American art and culture. It was a delight for me to be able to share some of their work with you, and I'm more than happy to try and answer any questions that you have about the Wyeth family of artists. Thank you, everybody, for your time and attention. I'm going to take a look at the Q&A here. Benita says his sense of color is so great. Could you comment on it? Also, did he use watercolor? You asked that around 10:56, and I'm wondering if you were talking about N.C. Wyeth at that point. Ooh, here we go. N.C. Wyeth's color is so great. As far as I know, he was just using oil paint, and we can see that he really gravitated towards these very vibrant colors. I mean, Maine has never looked so bright and cheery, and the waters off of Maine have never looked so blue. I'm not sure I have more to say than that, other than to agree with you, Benita, that his colors tend to be really vivid. I think very attractive, probably to like the young readers of the books that he illustrated. But beyond that, maybe we can sort of understand them as something that maybe his son Andrew was reacting against. JD says, couldn't they now do a DNA test on NC and his grandson to see if they were actually related in that way? They probably could. I don't know if anybody is interested. Well, I'm not sure if they were buried or cremated, or if anybody's really interested in doing that, but you probably could. Julie says, was Christina Olson crippled and unable to walk? Yes. Oh, thank you for asking that, Julie, because I didn't make that clear. So Anna Christina Olson, the famous figure lying in the grass in Christina's world, she was in fact crippled. She did not have polio. She had a degenerative muscle disease, which meant that she did not have the use of her legs, and she never wanted to use a wheelchair. She never wanted to use crutches, so she actually pulled herself around her farm just using her arms. And so you can see these kind of scrawny, sinewy arms that she has, but these really big hands. And Andrew Wyeth just became fascinated by it. He referred to her as being queen-like. He said she was Maine. Gail says, what medium is this one? If you're talking about Christina's World, this is also egg tempera. So apparently the Wyeths were famous for their meringues because Andrew Wyeth was always going out and buying eggs for his egg temperas. So he would use the yellow yolk and then the egg whites could be used for meringues. So this is a very old-fashioned way of painting. It's like the way artists like Botticelli painted. You can't really blend colors as easily with egg yolk tempera. It's like every line is there and it remains there. So it's a particularly effective medium for like painting these grasses, painting the details on the house this way. But it does have this kind of matte finish when it dries. Um, Somebody else asked, which son was the father of NC's grandson who was killed? That would have been Nathaniel was the father, and it was his wife, Caroline. Tish says, so Nathaniel was the one who was the inventor. I think he worked for DuPont too and had a number of uh, uh, patents under his name. He was a very creative person in his own right. Tish is here today. Tish, thanks for your question. She says, what books would you recommend on this fascinating and talented family? Thank you, Tish, for asking. Normally, I keep a little bibliography at the end of my talks, and I'm afraid I don't have it in my notes here. I apologize. Off the top of my head, I would probably go to the sources, the great museums that are the repositories for so much of this work are the Brandywine River Museum in Chadds Pennsylvania, and then the Farnsworth Museum up in Rockland, Maine. And I might go to their websites and look at the books that they have available for sale because those are, especially the Brandywine River Museum, the experts on all things Wyeth. Somebody else asked, will there be any other great-grandchildren who might continue the dynasty? Great question. Jamie Wyeth and his wife never had children, but I do know that some of the other Wyeths did, or some of Andrew Wyeth's siblings did have children. So there are probably some descendants out there. Maybe we'll hear from them, but I don't know of anybody who's trying to eke out a career as an artist at the moment. And similar question from JD. I hope I got that right for you. Somebody said, I missed the beginning, the significance of the tire tracks. Well, a lot of people like to read into those tire tracks because NC Wyeth, when he passed away, was driving his car and had his grandson in the car with him. And then his car stopped on train tracks, and a train came and hit the car and killed both NC Wyeth and his son, his grandson, I should say, who's named for him. So people sometimes read significance into car tire tracks in Andrew Wyeth's paintings in particular. That might be a little heavy-handed psychologically speaking, but maybe it's not. And then Diane said, whose wife did NC have a rumored affair with, Andrew's or Nathaniel's? Nathaniel's. How did that affect the relationship with the son? I don't know the full details there. That's a really good question for each of us to explore afterwards. Jean said, is it true that Andrew, after NC's death, his paintings became more monochromatic? Jean, I think you can make that case, but I mean, he was also using this egg yolk tempera. So his paintings tended to look pretty matte to begin with. So let me just double check the year for this picture. This might have been just prior to his father's death. Let me just double check here. Oh, I don't have it in my notes, I don't think. But we do know that this picture is just after his father's death, and it does have these very muted monochromatic tones to it. And Emily says, is Andrew's wife, Betsy, also an artist? Betsy was like her husband's manager. She played this huge role in taking care of the business side of his art. She would also set up these little like still life vignettes for him to paint throughout his career. if you've seen, I have another program on artists inspired by Maine. There's even this island that Betsy and Andrew lived on where she like dug out this pond simply for the reflective possibilities with like the night sky. She had a huge role in his career, but I'm not sure that she ever painted herself per se. Mike says, is Jamie still alive and painting? Will the dynasty end with him? He is still alive and painting. I would also, if you're interested in Jamie Wyeth, try to catch my other program on artists inspired by Maine, because there's so many fascinating Jamie stories out there. But like I said, he and his wife never had any children. Greg says, the bird you highlighted in Andrew's self-portrait appears to be a turkey vulture. Significance or symbolism? Great question. Thanks for identifying the bird. I'm not sure if it does have any significance. It sort of looks like it's in like a chase with this other bird, perhaps. We could read into it what we wanted, right? I was just sort of interested in its placement in terms of the composition, but Greg, you're good to identify it. You probably got a lot of us thinking about the significance there. Gail says, do I have any more talks coming up? Robert and I are in the process of nailing down a schedule for more morning talks, I think, but I have plenty of talks coming up in the evening. You can always check my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com, and click on the calendar page, and there are links to more free talks like this. The talk that I've debuted this month, actually just last night, is on Leonardo da Vinci, so that's a lot of fun. Jean says, did Andrew meet his wife in Maine? And yes, he did. Actually, Andrew's wife, Betsy, introduced him to Anna Christina Olsen, like on their first or second date up in Maine. And in fact, Andrew's wife, Betsy, it's her body that's used for most of Anna Christina's body in this painting, because you can see Anna Christina Olsen was had a more significant form than Betsy Wyeth ended up having. So Betsy Wyeth is really involved in all of these paintings. Tara says, the stunning judgment of what is art seemed to plague N.C. Wyeth. His work is incredibly beautiful, and yet he strived to be a real fine artist. Would you say this is true? Tara, you put that beautifully. And I would say that this was a major source of angst in his life. This idea that he didn't quite make it as a fine art artist or as an easel artist. This was something that he always aspired to. Some art historians say like his mother was like driving him to feel that way. These days, I don't think any one of us would really like split the difference. And you know, you're making art, you're making a living off of your art. It's fine either way. It's interesting because I think a lot of people extrapolate like this feeling of shame that he had for being a commercial artist over to other commercial artists, like people like Norman Rockwell, who never felt that way. He never needed to be a fine art artist per se, but this was something that really did plague N.C. Wyeth. Francine says, can you use egg yolk tempera only on a portion of a painting, or can you use it on the entire painting? I believe they were making entire paintings out of egg yolk tempera. Yes. Do you have any comments about Christina and what she's looking at? Benita asks. I always sensed that she was looking at the farmhouse, that she, like my sense was always like, there's this desperation to get back to that house, or maybe even to, I guess when I first saw it as like a young woman, it was like a sense of escaping that house, of being away from the house. But I think that's just me as a young woman projecting something. But there does seem to be this connection between the body and the building, right? And there seems to be this state of paralysis. And like I said, kind of a sense of urgency. Something's happening. The wind's kind of like whipping her hair. Even if you don't know that she is paralyzed in this moment, you sense it. Like it's just this frozen moment in time, and she needs to be somewhere else. Maybe it feels like there's an emergency, almost like she's fallen. There's a lot you can kind of pull out of this fascinating image, right? Gary said, what's the name of the painting of the open window with the white curtains? That is a great painting, isn't it? Oh, here it is. Let me just double check my notes. It is called Wind from the Sea from 1947, and that is a tempera. I believe that might be from the National Gallery of Art. Yes. Jane says, I've seen in Andrew's paintings, he will often use a small amount of color, like a cobalt blue in a bucket or an old newspaper. Can you comment on this? He does use color very sparingly and judiciously and effectively. Jean, I would agree with you. Sometimes it just pops in his paintings. And if you enjoy looking at Andrew Wyeth's paintings and you're on Facebook, for example, I highly recommend joining an Andrew Wyeth or Wyeth family Facebook fan page, because then you can just get these like gorgeous images popping up in your social media feed, and it's so satisfying. And they are striking. Like every single one of them will just kind of knock you off your feet. They're gorgeous. Mike says, wasn't Betsy aware of Andrew's affair with Olga and somewhat condoned it? Mike, I don't know if we'll ever really know the story of that affair and Betsy's knowledge of it. We do know, well, it's been suggested sort of after all of that hubbub and like being on the cover of Time and Newsweek, which we know was like a huge deal in the 1980s. Like no other artist had been featured on the cover of Time and Newsweek simultaneously like this. It has been suggested since that time that this was a very sophisticated media move that the Wyeths did intentionally, and that maybe there wasn't an affair, and maybe this was just a way to kind of package and market these paintings because it did get his name in the news, and all press is good press, perhaps. Maybe there was an affair for some reason. I tend to think that there wasn't. But I don't think we'll ever know for sure. Robert, thank you for your praise here. And I'm just gonna check out the chat. I'm not sure if there are any more great questions there. Let's see. Shorty reminds me of Adolf Hitler. I have to agree. That incredible portrait by Jamie Wyeth, I agree. And his JFK portrait, I agree. So great. I think we answered the Anna Christina question about being crippled. Jamie Wyeth is alive, but he doesn't have any children. And yes, and Carolyn asked, was Betsy instrumental in naming and managing Andrew's work? Yes. She was deeply involved in this. Frank, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for your very kind words. Emily mentioned the turkey vulture appears in another work called Soaring. Thanks for adding that in. And Neural says, where were there artists in the generations before NC, or was he the first artist in his family? As far as I know, I think he was. And I think, Robert, that's all the questions. I really appreciate the very kind words from people and for spending your morning with me. This is my favorite way to spend the day. So thank you for helping me make it happen. Thank you, Robert.
So, folks, let's give Jane a big virtual round of applause. As Jane said, I am in the process of booking October and November programs with Jane, so stay tuned. Jane will be back. We are partnering with the Chelmsford Library for a talk with Jane in 2 weeks on Thursday, September 26th. That one's going to be at night at 7 o'clock on Zoom, and that is on Leonardo da Vinci. So that'll be 2 weeks from tonight, 7 o'clock, Leonardo da Vinci. And I will be booking Thursday morning programs with Jane real soon, and you'll get all that information via email. When you exit the Zoom today, make sure to take 60 seconds and fill out the feedback survey. That would be greatly appreciated. Look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to this recording. And as I said, some information about some other upcoming art history programs. And with that, I want to thank the York Library. I want to thank the Friends of the Library. I want to thank the Corning Life Sciences Foundation. I want to thank Jane. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Jane.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Bye.